Hey, welcome to 49cc Scoot. My name's Brent. One of the most popular comments about any of my recent builds is that I need a bigger carburetor. I've been satisfied with how the 28mm VHST that comes with the RC1 kit performs, aside from having more float-related issues than any other carb that I've ever owned, but it seems like everyone else uses a 34mm PWK, so I want to see if that makes a noticeable difference for me. I can find 34mm PWK carbs anywhere from around $20 for generic stuff to over $300 for a genuine key-in, but I went with Polini's version that falls roughly in the middle of that range. It's a non-power jet version, which some prefer and some would rather have a power jet. I'm fine without it since I've only used one carb with a power jet before, and I could take it or leave it from that experience. The primary reason that I chose the Polini carb is that my friend Ryan Ott uses it and he shared his tuning info with me. Plus, we ride together sometimes, so I figured it could make dialing them in a little bit easier for both of us if we have the same carburetor. PWKs are flat slide carburetors, so as you could guess, the slide or the throttle valve is flat, or at least relatively flat. One side is curved, but it's much flatter than the round slides and even the sort of hybrid oval shape that the VHST uses. One advantage of flat slides is that they tend to be thinner, so the carb can also be thinner, which may make them easier to fit, and also creates a shorter path to the air filter or atmosphere, which may be beneficial, particularly for high revving setups. Here's a look at the 34mm PWK alongside the 28mm VHST that I've been using. I took a few measurements and you can see that the PWK is a little bit taller, but otherwise actually smaller than the VHST's outside dimensions. The big PWK has larger inlet and outlet diameters already, and I picked up this Stage6 Bellmouth/air filter adapter that is advertised to improve airflow into the carburetor, which requires a 70mm air filter instead of the standard 54mm. If I were looking for a Bellmouth to use without a filter, then I'd probably look for one with more rounded edges at the entrance. But my hope was that the design would work well with an air filter and be similar to Malossi's filter, which has a sort of rubber Bellmouth inside of it. I got a 70mm dual-layer Stage6 filter to go along with it. Since the outlet side of the carb is also larger, I needed a new intake, and I picked up the Malossi X360 Bonneville intake designed to mount 32 to 34mm carburetors on C1 and RC1 engines. I already had this Malossi intake around, which is the same one that Ryan uses, but he's had problems with his carburetor not wanting to stay in the intake lately, so I wanted to try something different, and the Bonneville intake is basically just a larger version of the intake that comes with the RC1, and that's worked well enough for me so far. Otherwise, I've got some tuning supplies, starting with a Polini PWK needle kit, which has 10 different needles. I like that every needle comes with a clip, so if I ever lose a clip, I'll have plenty of replacements on hand. I bought Stage6 pilot and main jet kits just because they saved me some cash versus their Polini counterparts. The pilot jet set goes from 35 to 58, so it should cover anything I'm likely to need. I bought two main jet kits, starting with this one with sizes from 150 to 172, and this one with 180 to 205, so I should have plenty of jets, though now I'm getting paranoid that I'll need a 175 or so that falls between the two kits. One thing that I've learned about main jets is to buy everything from one brand whenever possible. I used to mix and match jets, but I found out the hard way that sizes don't always match up exactly when dealing with different manufacturers. So suddenly I'm wishing I spent the money on the Polini jet kits that don't skip sizes in the middle. Are you trying to make your scooter faster? How about just repair or maintain it? Maybe you want to do some suspension or appearance mods. Whatever it is that you're after, check out ScooterTuning.ca. They're in Canada, but they still offer amazing service even for me in the United States. And if you order anything over $200, then your order ships for free. Plus, it's very quick shipping. A lot of the stuff gets here in 1 to 3 days. They also support this channel by giving me a discount on parts. So that helps all of us because I can buy more parts, that makes my scooter faster, but also because I'm trying out more parts, I can share more information that I learn along the way with everybody else. So please support someone that supports the scooter community and check out ScooterTuning.ca. The first thing that I wanted to do was install the Bellmouth and see how it fit, but it didn't fit at all. It turns out that this was meant for smaller versions of the PWK, but I didn't realize that. I needed to figure out if I could make the air filter adapter work, or if I needed to get a different filter. So I started by measuring the adapter, which was about 50.5 millimeters, and the carb, which is just over 54 millimeters, but with a 55 millimeter lip on the edge. I removed the set screws, added a single layer of masking tape to protect the finish, and chucked the adapter in the mini lathe to cut the mounting diameter first. I only cut the Bellmouth to 54 millimeters, which isn't actually big enough to fit over the lip on the carburetor, because I planned to cut the lip off and make it a better fit instead of having the whole adapter 1 millimeter oversized for most of the mounting surface. I disassembled the carb before machining it for a few reasons. First off, it wouldn't fit in my lathe with the bowl and cap in place. I wanted to expose as little of the carb to chips and dust from cutting, and also I like to give new carburetors a thorough cleaning before use anyway, just in case there's something left over from manufacturing. I turned both the idle speed and mixture screws in and counted how many turns it took to seat them and noted those numbers before removing them. That way I can set it back to how it came from the factory when it's time to reassemble it. I also noted jet sizes, needle marking, and needle clip position, as well as measuring float height. Once all of the easily removable stuff was gone, I chucked the carb up and cut the outer lip off, leaving the inner lip as a stop. Then I made a couple of very light passes to make the cast mounting area slightly more concentric without changing the diameter too much. At that point the adapter would fit, but there was a big mismatch between the adapter and the mouth of the carb, even though I had already taken a little bit off of it. I was also left with a large lip that was only going to get bigger as I cut the ID to match the carb, so I knew I would need to cut away some of the backside as well to thin that for a better transition. Here's how thick it wound up after matching the diameter. Unfortunately, I did a terrible job of filming the thinning cuts, but once those were done, then the adapter could no longer reach the mouth of the carb. The rear had to be cut down to allow it to sit far enough on to work properly. It finally fit, but I hadn't wanted to cut the lip very thin since there wasn't much of a lip left after matching the carburetor's mouth, so it didn't leave a very smooth transition. I used a file and then sandpaper to shape the lip a bit better. The last problem was that the set screw holes were now right on the edge of the adapter and not enough material was left for me to trust them. They may have worked, but I played it safe and drilled and tapped new set screw locations. My M4 tap that matched the originals was broken, so I wound up installing M5 by 0.8 set screws. I cleaned the body with carburetor cleaner and compressed air before adding medium strength thread locker to each set screw. Then the rest of the carb was cleaned and reassembled. When it was time to install jets, I used recommendations from Ryan instead of the factory jetting. He's used the same carb on his RC1, and I know it runs strong, so this should at least give me a better starting point. The pilot jet was switched from a 42 to a 52, and the main jet was changed from 122 to 185. Ryan actually listed a 184 for his main jet, but 185 was the closest in the Stage6 kit. I also changed out the N68E needle with the clip in the center position for the JJL needle with the clip in the leanest top position as listed by Ryan. With the carb cleaned and prepped, it was time to install it, beginning with removing the 28mm VHST and the standard RC1 intake. I removed the reed block as well so I could inspect the reeds and check to see how well it matches to the new intake. The reeds still looked great with no distressed edges after more than 2,500 miles of use. The Bonneville intake comes in two pieces, so the rubber boot needs to be inserted into the aluminum plate. This rubber is pretty firm and tough to work with at room temperature, so it helps to heat it with a heat gun or a hair dryer, and Malossi says not to exceed 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, which is about 120 to 140 Fahrenheit. Then you can tilt it and push the reed side in and through. Once it's all the way through, it can be rotated to fit the way that you want it to. I aimed the inlet just a little toward the CVT side because that worked well for me with the original intake and created a small amount more clearance between the bottom of the carb and the rear fender. Once the boot was clocked where I wanted it, I pushed it into the flange and seated it all the way around. A quick look made it obvious that the new intake was larger than the stuffer in the reed block. I didn't want the incoming mixture to hit a wall or to dump quite so suddenly from the intake to the open reed block, so I thought my best course of action would be to port match the stuffer to the intake. I bolted the intake and reeds together, and then it was easy to see the mismatch. A sharp scribing tool was used to mark the stuffer, and then it was cut with a carbide burr with frequent checks to be sure that it matched without going too far, because there wasn't a lot of room to go further in some of the areas of the stuffer. I also knocked off the rough edges left from casting in the intake boot. Then everything was washed and dried before loosely mounting the intake. I wanted to see if I had any clearance issues that may require the intake to be rotated before torquing it down, so I put the carb in place and took a look around. It appeared to be a good fit. I had no trouble installing the carb, and there was sufficient clearance between the bowl and the fender. I torqued the intake and installed the carb and filter properly with clamps. The filter does rest on the fender, but I'm thinking that may actually be a good thing. I had to make a bracket to support the VHST with the 360 intake to keep it from drooping or bouncing, but the filter may actually provide a little bit of support this way. The fuel line was pushed on, and then I secured the overflow hose so it would be toward the rear and aimed outward away from the tire. Next up, I put the seat bucket on to see if I had enough clearance for the cable or if the bucket had to be modified, and I was happy to find that I had plenty of room. Even though it should fit, I prefer to use a curved cable adapter if the cable is going to need to bend very much, so I removed the cap and switched to the same adapter that I was using on the VHST. If you need an adapter, try searching for Del Orto throttle cable adapter, and quite a few should come up. I tried using the throttle cable that I had on the bike, but it didn't leave enough free cable length to operate the carb, so I had to switch to one that was previously modified by cutting the housing back. You can also buy cables intended for PWK carburetors, but just make sure they're compatible with the size of your PWK and the style of throttle that you use. To install the cable, it's first important to pay attention to the plastic spring collar. One end is smaller and round for the throttle spring to fit over it, so that end will face up. The other end has a round side and a flatter side. You might assume that the flat side would match up to the flat side of the throttle valve, but it's actually the opposite, and you need the flatter side facing the curved side of the throttle valve. If you drop the collar in the right way, you'll see that it covers the entire opening, but if you put it in the wrong way, it leaves a gap. I adjusted as much slack as I could into the cable and then put the cable through the cap, spring, and collar and held them compressed while I pushed the cable end down into the slide. You should see a slot for the cable to go through and an area for the barrel to sit in. Once the cable is positioned like that, the spring can be slowly released so the collar goes all the way down into the throttle valve. The whole assembly then goes back into the carb and the cap can be screwed on before adjusting the cable slack. This can usually be done by feel. I take out slack with the adjusters near the throttle and the carb until there's a very small amount of movement in the throttle before the slide starts to move. I always leave a little bit of slack because it will allow you to adjust the idle lower, assuming that your idle speed screw isn't all the way out already, but also because it prevents the throttle from being pulled if there is any minor pressure or bending of the cable for some reason. Full travel of the throttle valve needs to be checked to make sure the cable setup is correct. The slide should be able to sit against the stop when closed and move all the way up out of the bore when open. The throttle can be held wide open while pushing up on the slide to make sure the cable pulls it all the way up. If not, you may have too much slack in the cable, or you may have to make changes to the cable or the throttle that you're using. I reinstalled the air filter, turned the fuel supply on, pulled the choke up, and fired it up for the first time with my new carb. That completes the installation of the carb, so I'm going to wrap this video up here. But make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you won't miss the tuning process, as well as testing to find out if the larger carb does improve performance. If you've enjoyed this video or found it useful, please give it a like. Thank you for watching.